Welcome to episode 17 of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Last episode, it was focused on Africa. What were the drivers behind basically Africans being led to ports and being sold into slavery and to never be seen again by their land of origin, right? It was going on for like 200 to 300 years. What we're going to discuss is the Middle Passage, what it may or may not have been like, and try and just feel the situation, which many of us would have done. We're then going to obviously cover what they may have experienced, or what it would have been like on first landing upon the Americas or the Caribbean plantations, more specifically. Anyway, let's get into this right now. Let's start off. The Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade movement was the voyage that European seafarers would undertake after they offloaded industrial goods from Europe and set sail for the Western Hemisphere. The slave ships would have been cramped, squalid, and rife with the incubation of disease. The journey would often take several months, with millions of Africans succumbing to poor conditions or being executed for mutiny. Many were thrown overboard, of which could be claimed as an expense via insurance, brokerage, viaduct, Lloyd's of London. Right, so as we know from before, Europeans in their industrial age would offload goods to Africans, and for whatever reasons they would give them diamonds when the Europeans would just give them their manufactured mineral goods or whatever they were, that the Africans were so excited about, made them give up everything, their own people even, right? But the Middle Passage would be the voyage from West Africa to the Caribbean. Obviously it would be fraught with disease, lots of death, lots of people thrown overboard through disease, through not being wanting to be kept because they may infect the rest of who's on the boat, which obviously stands to reason. But we've learnt that they were covered via insurance, so it was a real sophisticated system back then, that was all rigged or all properly organised, the slave trade. So if black people were thrown overboard, they would be recompensed and recompensated upon landing back in the UK via their insurance brokerage that underwrote what mission they were going on. So that obviously leads you to believe, like, when they would have got to West Africa, everything would have been accounted for. How many slaves they had had to have been accounted for them to be able to claim back insurance for basically throwing people overboard. Now, we can think back, there were no cameras back then. Our mind's eye can envisage all type of madness. Could be, yes, someone's ill and they're diseased, then they're going to infect the whole ship, aren't they? So potentially they may need to be cold, but then could you imagine like a fighting African, someone who's been wrongly put on a slave boat, or could be a king, went for a parley with the enemy and was taken hostage, and next minute he's on a boat and he regurgitates himself in 300 years time. How do you know? But anyway, real serious thing gone on here, and it's not nice, like, especially someone of the own diaspora, when you hear that millions, they can't even really account for it, even though it should be, because for you to claim by insurance means that you would have someone would know how many you took, but no one would ever truly know the amount of mortality that happened at sea, the amount of people that were thrown overboard and never given any chance of getting to the Americas. That was a survival in itself, like enduring the voyage to the Caribbean. Anyway, let's move on. Wind assisted by the trade winds that would expedite a painstaking journey after months of vertigo, believing one is in the same position of the natural shipping lane entry into the Americas would be around the Windward Islands. Tailgated by Caribbean trade winds, Barbados, Grenada and Martinique were most probably the first landing ports that fresh Africans would be disembarked from. They would then be offloaded at regular stops along the island chain before the remaining chattel would be put to auction at the American slave markets that would be within the vicinity of the USA's historical Deep South as the final destination. Right, so in a straight line, coming from the ports of West Africa, the first island to be approached or met by any seaman would be Barbados. It's not even, you could say, the Caribbean. It could be classed as the Atlantic Ocean in another world, right? So Barbados, the Windward Islands, that's where like the boats would tend to come through if they want to catch the trade winds and get there a lot quicker, right, to the Caribbean. So I always think to myself, what would have been the process? Would they have divided up slaves via tribes to make sure that they couldn't collude? Or would it be whoever was ill or looked like they couldn't handle much more of the journey, would they be sold first? Or would they sell their best first? Or was it all, we're going to go into this over time anyway maybe, but was it all like pre-order? So this plantation had an order for X amount of slaves, that plantation, but I think they would have looked at the health of the slaves, and depending on their health is how they would have selected them after the long arduous journey, yeah? But that's pretty much how it went according to extracts. So that therein lies that doesn't matter, like we may be speaking different languages, but someone from Martinique, Dominica, Barbados, all these people, you're all of the same diaspora, you're all virtually cousins, you all pretty much share a father or a mother like 10-15 generations ago. So you're all family, like you're all family along the whole island chain, really. You're all, you can all find a DNA link that is very, very close, even though you may look different, right, or not so. So it's just important to remember that fact. You're all on the same boat, you all went through the same situation, and you all went through the same wickedness that was going on them small islands. I think, because a lot of like people from my part of the world, they're quite tough, like in certain ways, right? Do you know what I mean? Grenada, a place like that. Every time I meet a Grenadan, like they're quite strong men, big strong men, right? Like Daniel Dubois, for example, right? Which we're going to go into later maybe, right? But yeah, like, there was a lot of wickedness going on there. I'm sorry, man. We know it. We can feel it. We know, But anyway, let's move on. I'm digressing. Let's move on. Upon entering the fruitful plantation system, a slave could expect the honeymoon period of what was known as seasoning school. This was a process where slaves would be put through their paces in preparation for graduating into the fields of labour. It would consist of a breaking down ordeal whereby a freshly arrived African would be spiritually degraded and tortured close to death, if necessary, to mould a robotic, obedient and docile worker that would provide return on investment and draw little muster of rebellion. In this part of the black African story in the Caribbean, they would also have been separated from tribal members as to avoid forming circles of collusion and camaraderie that would cocktail the light of optimism. On some islands, African drums would be outlawed, as vibrational flow was seen as a communication between slaves that could be channeled into raising spirits that would evoke the slave master's paranoia of awakening the marauding African giant. Every slave would not have escaped the ceremony of renaming. Stripping one of their ancestral names was a degradation designed to draw the soul away from its original location. So, according to readings, upon disembarking into the Caribbean, there would, most slaves would go through an induction process known as seasoning school, and this is where the slave would be broken down. Similar to like a horse, when they say you break a horse, right? They would be broken down degraded, and renamed as well, you know, and they would be broken down to the state to where they'd be changed, they'd be transformed or converted into like a robotic being that wouldn't muster rebellion. Because could you imagine, these slave masters were always outnumbered by the slaves, but the slaves never really, they did rebel, but not to where they could, because they could have taken them out at any time, right? So there was a significant psychological hold on them, you know. And people like to think, why didn't people fight? You know, when oppression is taken out against one, like you know, you cannot tell how people will respond en masse. You know, you see all these big, strong black men walking around the streets of London now. You don't know how oppression works. It's a psychological pressure that is taken out against a whole community. You know, I remember like I was reading an extract somewhere, and like in the World War, the Jews were being led towards Auschwitz concentration camp, right? And you know, there'd be like thousands, like 1,000 men, and there'd only be like 5 or 10 concentration camp guards, yeah. And really, 1,000 men should be able to overpower those men, but such was the climate of fear, such was the oppression, they couldn't, you know. So can you imagine like where people's minds are with oppression, which is why things like this can't come back. Well, you never know, right? But just drawing a little bit of a comparison there, yeah, as to how like big, strong men, male figures can be oppressed and isolated and subjugated and then just degraded spiritually to where they can't even fight back is a sad thing, no matter where it happens in the world, right? And yeah, that happened to my ancestors, and also as well as that, they were like renamed, you know, had their name taken away from them, so they would have had all their spiritual identity drawn out of them pretty much. But it always lives on, you know, because, you know, there's things that we do and say, music, whatever, we can see the link between Africa, even though it's 300 years removed. They'll hear music from the Caribbean and they feel it on a higher level, even more so than their own. Some Africans, yeah, they'll feel reggae music and whatever, they feel it, yeah. So it was never gone, but to as much as they could, they treated them like an animal, like a horse, where you were broken down, put through your paces, and made to be a good performing slave, yeah. Anyway, let's move on. It must be noted that many European slave masters would privatize buxom African females for sexual servitude. This would undoubtedly have spawned a sizable mixed-race population within the African diaspora of the Caribbean. These practices would mean that many Caribbeans, via the helplessness of ravaging conquest, would be hosting European DNA spawned from the surname they carry. This conclusion leads one to the point that although names and identities were stripped, the mere fact of slave masters holding power over the breeding program and having presumably first choosing of female livestock means many Caribbean people partly originate from the bloodline of the surname from which they hold title, confirmed by the complexion of St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. So, just something a bit personal, start off, right? You know, you're going through hard times, people say change your name, whatever, right? Now, Oscar is like my my family name, right? But then you got like Stevens. That's my grandmother's like maiden name, yeah. And my middle name is Stephen. So I've basically got my grandmother's surname and my granddad's surname in my name. So I can't do it. But also I thought deeply. I was watching Who Do You Think You Are? And Ainsley Harriott, the chef, the celebrity chef, right? He actually is a Harriott by birthright. I think his great grandfather was Scottish or whatever whatever it was, but he actually is by birthright. He's nothing more than a Harriet. So whether it's through rape or whether it's through love or whatever, a lot of people with the surname that they've got, you'll have a bloodline relative that's actually got that surname. Yeah. So chances are, by birthright, with will or against will, you are actually a bloodline of that family name. You know, very, very high probability, you know, especially in Caribbeans, you know. Now, obviously, like in Jamaica, there's a place where, and I believe it's where my son's family are from as well. They're quite light. Like there's like a light skinned population that for hundreds of years have been sort of mixed, you know, Caribbean, yeah. And so that shows like the European and the Caribbean history. So it shows like you know, you may change your name, but you actually are that surname. So you should feel proud of it and own it and turn it into something positive, you know. But what I really wanted to go into next was like, you know, I was reading the memoirs. No, not reading. I was watching a documentary, right? And you know, a white slave master who was meant to be a good slave master wrote in his memoirs of sexual encounters with black African slaves, female slaves, up to 4,000 entries in his memoirs or in his diary. Right, 4,000 sexual experiences. I don't think contraception was there in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, right, as it is now, right? So can you imagine that he had 3,000 to 4,000 sexual experiences with African slaves, female slaves, right? A slave master, right? So you've got all these guys in the dance hall saying they're like king of the dance hall. They got all the girls, this and that. Can you imagine that? A little scrawny, like English or Scottish, whatever, slave master. Let me go into sort of London talk, right? Has gone through the whole Jamaican race, as you could say at some stage. Do you know what I mean? Mind boggles sometimes, but yeah. Can you imagine like that's what was happening? So yeah, regarding the breeding program, you know, I've gone on about this in another video. Parseka in Brazil, he was like a 7-foot slave, quite docile, but very strong, athletic, and basically half the population in this place in Sao Paulo, I think in Brazil, most of the population, they can all trace back to him because they just got him breeding. So no doubt back then, like they would have made the strong breed the strong, which is something I spoke about before. Like we don't do that now. We choose females on sexual selection. Back then, they were making the strong breed the strong, which maybe allowed for us to get through the rigors of slavery, you know. And that's why a lot of us are sort of far strong, you could say, or whatever, some of the most athletic people in the world. And that can't be sort of denied, you know, on an individual basis. Forget about a sport where you go in and learn just athletic ability. Caribbeans are quite like probably, you know, if you dotted at world champions, sprinting, stuff like that, running, certain athletic, explosive sports, boxing, whatever, you would say like it's a hotbed. Yeah, for an individual to do something on their own athletically. Maybe this is the reason why. Because of like the breeding program and also just like the harshness, you would have had to overcome disease that was there, that was rife, being rationed food wise, eating the worst type of food no matter what, even though some of it was sent from Africa to be replanted, and it would have just been a tough, hard time, which we're going to go into further down the line, yeah. But just wanted to say, man, out to Caribbean people, this is why you're champions of survival. You got through that. You had an ancestor, generation after generation, that spawned you or me, and that's why you're so strong. Now, there's obviously millions of you, so you mirror against each other, but that process there makes you on your own as a standout very, very strong, you know. And yeah, anyway, that's that. Let's move on. After the seasoning process and depending on fitness, a working age black African due to harsh conditions could be expected to survive anywhere between 3 and 8 years as a life expectancy. Bad slave conditions inevitably created a severe need for continual replenishment. After 1661 Barbados Slave Act being ratified by law, it was compiled in amendment that differing from Irish unruly, English and Scottish and Welsh poor that were in servitude, the black African would remain in bonded contract to their assigned slave masters for life, with the added benefit of any children born of a black slave also qualifying for the sentence of lifelong slavery. So in 1661, I believe, Barbados Slave Act. This was the first British colony in the Caribbean, and what it codified into law or into the constitution in Barbados was that anybody European and white could do an indentured servitude contract, but they wouldn't be enslaved. When, on the other hand, black Africans that were now going to be shipped into the Caribbean from the second they got there, because the Irish were there first during the Cromwellian conquest around about the 1650s, but when they knew they were going to start to transport Africans, they rejigged the laws so that blacks would definitely be enslaved, and also their children would be enslaved, and their children's children, and it continued, as we know, up until 1800, pretty much 300 years, right? So that's the Barbados Slave Act of 1661. You could say it was a racist law put into place, technically, because it allowed the Irish Europeans freedom of movement to a degree, even though they would have lived a second-class citizenship. But the black African was made to abide by a law that meant they had no hope or no way out of slavery, even for their offspring and their offspring's offspring and their children, you know. So anyway, that says it all. Let's move on. Slave masters that would have wanted to maximize profiteering endeavors would have not needed much acumen to realize that some sort of program of breeding would amount economically. Moreover, establishing of an internal program where sexual selection akin to dog breeding, which has been experimented by mankind over thousands of years to domesticate, was to take precedent. It's a certainty that attributes in brutal exclusion of natural selection would have been subconsciously disappeared in favour of the slave master's preferences that would have leaned towards a performing cruff who possessed the greatest social behaviour, along with athletic health being a fundamental factor, would be rewarded as first to breed. Many Caribbeans often speak amongst themselves that a talented minority of Caribbean males without thought or reason act in obedience of European social framework, often specialising in the category of the divisive comedic. Could it be that a select African population had suffered the effects of behavioural brainwashing and were environmentally engulfed by Eurocentric social power dynamics that signified simpletics? The lighter you are, the closer to the slave master you become. The whiter you are, the better one's existence will be, as creature comforts will be afforded to those served with a dose of historical amnesia. You know, finishing on a light note, I remember I was watching an interview from the comedian Richard Pryor, and he was talking about black people being promoted within sort of work, business, whatever, right, back in the 80s. And he said people like themselves. Yeah. And if a lot of black people act like white people, they'll do better, because people, it's not a racist thing. People will promote people that act like themselves. If you act like me, there's more likelihood I'm going to promote you, because I'm a manager, I'm a boss, and I want you to obviously carry on in my vein. or act like me. So if you're more like me, I'm gonna be more predisposed to choosing someone like you. Yeah, it's simple economical fact, simple fact, right? Simple social behavioural fact, right? People are only gonna go for people like themselves, yeah, unless there's a dynamic needed of somebody different. But general consensus is you're gonna go for people like yourself in some way, shape, or form, right? They may look different, but there's something about them, the way they think, the way they talk, yeah. You know, there's like certain people on the news I'll like, and they're like got a completely different accent, completely different walk of life, completely different Spotify, but there's something about them that, like, I feel like they could represent me, or like I'd promote them within myself, or I'd cover them, or whatever, vice versa, right? But you get where I'm going with this, yeah? People choose people like themselves, right? So, you know, it's often like sort of some black men are often chastised in the barbershops or in communities sometimes for performing to the gallery, or performing in a way like they may call it coonish behaviour or Uncle Tom, or acting as if like they're performing for European or white people, and they're forgetting about their race and whatever else. When sometimes like it's just like a social dynamic where like you need to potentially, sometimes you don't realise it, maybe act a certain way to get to a certain place, or you're just brought up in a certain way. Sometimes you could have went to a primary school where, you know, every single kid was white, but there was 2 or 3 black people. How are you going to speak? As opposed to someone that's gone to school in Brixton, which is a couple of miles away, where every kid was black and just a couple of white kids. How are you going to speak, you know? So like people will often like get tagged with like this person is a coon, or when they don't even know your background, they don't know what you've been through. For all they know, you could have been adopted and you're brought up by a white family, or you could be a mixed race kid, you never seen your black dad, and you might talk a certain way, but you're still black. You still got a story of struggle. You still was the only kid in like a school in Dublin or Ireland somewhere, and you're the only kid that's black here, and you ain't never seen your black dad. You ain't had no struggle, and people don't know that. And black people don't know that, yeah, and they think like you're some kind of, when it's far from, you know. So that can, sorry, it's touch a nerve, but like, you know what I mean. I'm sure a lot of people can draw similar grounds, yeah. But it all goes back to like maybe slavery, because lighter skinned, it said that lighter skinned black people were given better opportunities. They were allowed to be closer to the house, when the darker skinned black people were working in the field exclusively, unless there was some type of cause for them needing to be closer to the property. And what it was, or I think it was that, you know, the lighter skinned were potentially mixed race and were potentially fathered by the slave masters. And so the slave master would see their self in the child. They may not own the child. They may not say even own up to the fact that the child is theirs, but they would see their self in the child. You know, naturally, they would see their features in these light-skinned children that they would have spawned potentially, but not owned up to it, yeah? And so because they can see, they're still slaves, but because they can see themselves, they would have naturally give them better opportunities, just because they can see themselves, and they are half white, if you know what I mean, yeah? Although I don't like to use that word, they're mixed, right? So that there created in the black community a bit of a division sometimes, where they feel as though light-skinned people are given better opportunities, or seen as more pretty, or seen as, but it all stems back to the field, because that was going on in the Americas too, where the lighter-skinned people were given slight preferential treatment, and still slaves, but just slightly higher up the hierarchical order. And also, like, just like black people seeing, like, even like in India, whatever, just seeing lighter skinned people as maybe prettier or better looking amongst the dark skinned people. It's a real illusion or delusion of some people of colour to believe like certain people that are lighter are seen as more prettier. But it comes from like just like the ingrained over like hundreds of years of maybe lighter skinned people seeing as being higher up in terms of society, you know. And you know, even like I would say like my grandmother, like, yeah, man, a lighter skinned female to her is much prettier, when a dark skinned female, sorry, Gran's no longer here, isn't seen as pretty as to her. Do you know what I mean? Like an Indian girl walks in my grandma, she'll be like, what a pretty girl, what a pretty girl, what a pretty girl. But a darker skinned black woman, my grandmother's not going to say that. Doesn't matter how pretty she is. I don't think sorry, Gran, right? My Gran's not going to say that, yeah. But it's just like, I can tell that it's the way she's brought up. Like, lighter skinned people seem to, like, she thinks would be like, kind of prettier and better looking. And that's just the way it is, better hair and all the rest of it. And it's something that the community is attempting to making a misnomer out of, or just make it like something that's not absolutely true, because we know that it's not true, right? And it's all each to their own, you know, but it's been ingrained over like hundreds of years to think that way. And so some black men are pre-programmed in a certain way to, as soon as you come out the womb, I always say to people, like, we're in a westernized world, you're programmed to like anything that is favored by the Western world, or what's the status quo female, you know? So, or the other way around, you know, because look at women, Nigerian men, I'm pretty sure, like, if you like approach women in nightclubs or whatever with your African attire, yeah, no socks and shoes, yeah, right, as opposed to like a European suit, yeah, you'll probably get more response from having the European suit on as opposed to your own, like, your own traditional wear in certain quarters, right? So can you imagine, like, you have to dress like a European to attract a female that's African? So they're also programmed towards Eurocentricity without even realizing it. You have to dress like a European to actually appear smarter when you approach her with your dry ankles and your and your shoes or your slippers with your African attire on. She's like, "Oh, come out of here, man! I don't want you." Do you know what I mean? As was probably happening in the 90s, but now there's a resurgence, and being African's cool, right? But anyway, that ends this episode of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean, Part 17. Quite enjoyed this. Sort of brought this topics to a more contemporary state, or just give you the comparison, you know? And yeah, long and short of it is, the middle passage was quite arduous. You were lucky to survive. You're lucky to make it numerically, statistically. But then when you got there was a seasoning school, so the torture wasn't over. And you were literally broken down, had your spirit taken away from you, but not fully, because it still regurgitated itself in people like myself and you that are still here. But no doubt it was a tough period, because it's different. You're enslaved, but these people, they took your soul as well, you know, or part of your soul, you know, and they really stopped you from music. It was a real draconian, authoritarian time, you know, and you were lucky to get through that, you know, your ancestor was, and it's to be mentioned and to be realised. And then you got the Barbados Slave Act, which obviously was the first. It was a racist act, you could say, because it signified that a European could go free after working on contract, but then a black person was never free. And that continued for a couple of centuries until Europe grew a conscience, or just swelling numbers made it so they could no longer hold the fort because of what was going on in Napoleonic Europe. The Europeans were fighting, and the concentration went into inwardly, you know, Europe, controlling Europe, and then obviously Africa, the industrialization age met with like the need for raw materials. They're thinking Africa is the place that's needed next, so they've dropped all the slaves in the Western world and think, right, we need to scramble for Africa, and then now we're here in the world where we're in, right? So it's all about not just greed and supremacy at the top, you know. If they would have focused, I'm pretty sure we could have been enslaved to this day, but we were fighting as well. We fought against it, and we made it like not profitable as well, you know, and times were changing. But anyway, hope this message reaches you well. Once again, deliver this message straight to your heart, because it's from mine. All right, love, bless, love, one.